General says there is no point in continuing this fighting. He is willing to discuss a surrender.
Tell him to go to hell.
We haven't the proper facilities to take you all prisoner. Sorry.
What?
We'd like to, but we can't accept your surrender.
You're listening to a scene from the 1977 movie A Bridge Too Far, and this is the All-American Legacy Podcast.
This is the 82nd Airborne Division, fearless among fighting units.
From Fort Bragg, home of the airborne and the center of the military universe, this is the All-American Legacy Podcast. An inside look at the 100-year history of the 82nd.
They are all American, all the way.
This is Joe Buccino from the All-American Legacy Podcast. We've got a great episode today. For today's episode, I spoke with Dr. Phil Nash. Phil has been on the show before. He's an associate professor at Penn State, a nationally recognized expert on World War II. He's featured frequently on radio shows, on podcasts around the country, and he brings an interesting perspective to history, particularly to these kind of things we're talking about, World War II. It was a great discussion. We talk about the 1977 film A Bridge Too Far. Bridge Too Far is about Operation Market Garden. This was in September of 1944. This was a daring attempt to end World War II, the largest airborne invasion ever in history. But we explain all this in our discussion. You do not have to have any background knowledge to appreciate or enjoy this episode. So we do appreciate Dr. Phil Nash. What we try to do is sort of blend pop culture with history here today, and I think it worked out pretty well. You'll let us know. We want to talk to you about All-American Week. All-American Week 100. It is approaching May 22nd to May 25th here in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It is going to be the largest celebration of our legacy ever. It's going to be the biggest All-American Week ever. If you're a fan, a supporter, an alumni, you should be here for it. Go to our Facebook page to get all the information. Email us, 82nd Airborne Division PAO @gmail.com. We get a lot of emails. We respond to all of them. If you want more information, check out our websites, check out our Facebook, check out our Twitter, get in contact with us. People know how to call me. You can call me. We'll answer all your questions, but come to All-American Week. We want to see you here. Here's our discussion with Dr. Phil Nash. You know, the last thing we talked about on this show is D-Day. And so, right. Yeah, so June 1944, very successful invasion of Normandy, and that success led to Operation Market Garden, which is the focus of the movie A Bridge Too Far.
Right. D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies successfully land in Normandy and establish a beachhead. Then there's this brief problem period where the Allies get bogged down in Normandy for a variety of reasons, but it takes them about almost 2 months really to sort of break out. And once they do break out, they essentially trap a German army. A large part of it gets away, but they really do hand the Germans a serious defeat. And once they break out of Normandy, then you basically have this race across France, and it's really an amazing breakout. You have huge amounts of territory being gobbled up as the British and the Canadians head north toward Belgium. And the Americans, led by folks like Patton, people know, head east across France toward the German border. And they really do just gobble up immense amounts of territory. And then, as you get to early September, the race starts to bog down a bit. It's really not an issue really with German resistance, because German resistance had crumbled, and they were just sort of retreating pell-mell.
So by September, the Allies are winning.
Oh, absolutely, no question. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the big picture, the Allies are winning even before D-Day.
Right.
The Germans are already sort of being boxed in. D-Day obviously is a huge step forward, no question. But yeah, the Germans are retreating, and the Allies. The problem the Allies start to run into is their supply lines start to lengthen, and they don't have sufficient port facilities for all the gasoline and ammunition and supplies that they need to keep their armies moving forward. And listeners probably know about the Red Ball Express. Pretty soon the Allies are relying heavily on these massive truck convoys to keep the armies moving. And, of course, these truck convoys themselves consume an enormous amount of gasoline. And so the offensives start to peter out by the time you get to early September, and then it turns out that the Allies have to make some decisions with their limited supplies and fuel. They can't, and the movie Bridge Too Far actually explains this early on, they can't manage to sort of keep all the fronts full throttle at the same time, so they have to make a decision. And here's where Montgomery comes to Eisenhower with a proposal to have this sort of narrow offensive in the north across all these canals and rivers in Holland in an effort to sort of go around the German west wall, the Siegfried line, and to get onto the North German plain with sort of a single thrust. And, of course, there's this big strategic debate where, Eisenhower wants to advance on a broad front and Montgomery wants to sort of advance on a narrow front, led by Montgomery, of course. And Eisenhower, which is kind of interesting, Eisenhower agrees to this plan to sort of lay an airborne carpet. We can get into that now. It's called Operation Market Garden. And the idea was the market phase was you drop, was the biggest airborne drop in history, to lay down this carpet of airborne troops. Obviously achieved total surprise, seized control of a series of bridges over a sort of 64-mile-long corridor from the Dutch-Belgian border deep into Holland, and to put Allied forces on the north side of the Rhine. Anyway, so these airborne forces would take these bridges and hold them in long enough for the ground forces, that's the Garden phase, British 30th Corps, to advance along this road across these bridges and to end up in, sort of on the North German plain, essentially. That was the plan. And, of course, there's a lot going on here because you have this huge, that was actually called the First Allied Airborne Army. You had a massive airborne force. You'd only seen part of it, really, in D-Day. And there was a lot of pressure to use it. And in these early days of September, they had planned and canceled several airborne drops, but the ground forces were advancing too quickly and they had to cancel all these drops. So there was a lot of pressure internally to sort of use this airborne force. And this was Montgomery's plan, Market Garden, which Eisenhower approved.
Yeah, and so, one thing I didn't realize this until I think yesterday was that the weather was a factor for Eisenhower in the sense that the use of airborne forces was going to be significantly limited over the winter, and so they felt they were running out of time to do something grand. That was one factor. And then another factor, and then we'll talk about the movie. Enough with this stuff. But another factor is that, like the 82nd, so we just talked about the 82nd here. Mm-hmm. The 82nd hadn't been doing much because, they'd been out of the fight, waiting to be used again. And so you had these elite forces that could do something grand, and why the hell not use them was, I guess, kind of the more... Well, let's find a way to use them, I guess, is probably more appropriate. Right,
exactly, absolutely.
So, okay, so let's get into the movie. So Montgomery's not featured really in the movie, but there's a picture of Montgomery and Patton. And so the movie sets up, in the beginning of the movie, there's a Dutch woman explaining... setting it up in the way you just did.
Right.
And she says, Montgomery and Patton, she alludes to these big personalities. Montgomery and Patton were, in some ways, at war with each other. They were, if people don't know. If people don't know, Montgomery was in charge of the British, he was in charge of the British forces for the Allied side. Mm-hmm. Patton was, of course, everybody knows Patton, was the American general. And so there was a big, big egos at play here. And each one wanted to win the war, essentially get to Berlin the fastest, get into Germany the fastest. Right,
and part of Eisenhower's problem is he has to keep all these people happy, and it's a very, very difficult job.
Right. So, and so the idea is with this big thrust, Market Garden into Holland, then you secure the Rhine River, and then you get into Germany, and then, if you're thinking and this is in the movie, so if you're thinking all these things ahead, the war is over by Christmas.
Right.
1944, Christmas 1944. So that's all set up in the very first few minutes, and then from there, the movie goes into the personalities. And, it's when we're from our perspective here at All American Legacy Podcast, it's incredible that all this was planned in 7 days, and actually less than 7 days, because they left on the seventh day. So it took months to plan D-Day. You know, we have 2 episodes about D-Day, and it took months to plan D-Day, and all of this, it was the largest airborne assault in history. All of this was planned in 7 days. And then despite all that, when you get into the movie, factually correct, the airborne invasion was actually a success.
Right.
A daytime...
Yeah, the landing itself was sort of textbook in a lot of ways.
Right. So we talked about on this show all the problems that plagued the 82nd in Sicily, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in Sicily. A lot of that had to do with the wind and nighttime conditions and the lack of training for the pilots. And then Salerno and then Normandy, these same problems manifest in these other airborne assaults. But this was the 4th combat jump for the 82nd. They'd done it before. The pilots were better trained. They had the idea of Pathfinders was more fully refined. And it was daylight operation, so that made it a little easier. So
no, but and that's the thing. If you look at in fact, I think this is pretty true of all of the drops. The British 1st Airborne in the north, the 82nd in the middle, and the 101st at the southern end. The actually drops went very, very well, but. You know, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but part of the problem is, I mean, you know, and it went amazingly well considering how little planning there was. Yeah. But the big picture of the plan had all these flaws in a nutshell, basically. Too many objectives, too small of forces for those objectives, and often dropped too far away from those objectives. And that's particularly true of the British.
Right. So,
you know, airborne troops aren't great for attacking and moving long distance. They're supposed to drop at their objectives. You know, like the British 6th Airborne at D-Day, which, you know, landed a glider 50 feet from one of their objectives. You know, that's pretty good. This was a much more problematic plan.
Well, I think, so there's a couple of things here, is that I just want to talk about that if you see, just going back to this daytime airborne assault, it's very effective in the movie when you see the sky is sort of blanketed with aircraft, and then that's a great scene in the movie. But, you know, it's also very effective in the Band of Brothers, in the show Band of Brothers, that in the market garden scene, that the paratroopers hit the ground and they knew exactly what to do. They immediately, you know, and they can see each other. And so they're just moving in these very large formations. So we hadn't really seen that prior to this.
Right, yeah, they form up pretty quickly.
So, okay, so let's... that leads to, I think, the best scene. You know, General Bittrich, he looks outside, the German general. He looks outside and he says, and obviously the Germans speak German in the movie, and he says, to have such power in my hands. You know, he looks up sort of longingly, not with any fear, and he says he's very impressed. And that actually was said by General Kurt Student, who was...
Which would make more sense because he was a paratrooper.
He was a paratrooper, and he sort of developed the concept initially for the German forces. So, so that's that. Let's just, before we get in too deep into it, let's just talk about the characters in the movie.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the major players are depicted. Although, as you mentioned him, but it's kind of interesting. Who's not depicted is Montgomery, who doesn't actually show up. And I would argue that's actually kind of appropriate because if you look at his management of the battle, he really wasn't very engaged, which is very interesting, right? Because in a way, this is sort of his baby. Yeah. But I've read accounts where during the actual battle, he's sitting and having his portrait painted.
Right.
And is sort of oddly detached considering how much rides on this for him and his reputation. But all the other figures, you know, the head of 30th Corps, Brian Horrocks, played by Edward Fox, and General Sosabowski, the head of the Polish Parachute Brigade, who is attached to the British 1st Airborne, that's played by Gene Hackman. And there, of course, there's Julian Cook, who's commander of, 3rd Battalion, 504th. 3rd
Battalion, 504th for the 82nd. Yeah, he's played by Robert Redford.
Played by Robert Redford, who apparently was paid $2 million for the role. Which
I didn't know
the whole movie cost about $26 million, just to give you some idea. Yeah, there's a lot of good trivia about this on the Internet Movie Database, and apparently Sean Connery, who plays the head of the British 1st Airborne, Roy Urquhart, he apparently was very unhappy when he found out how much money Robert Redford was being paid and demanded that his own pay be raised.
That doesn't seem like a lot of money, though. I guess back then it was probably
well, no, yeah, back 40 years ago it was a lot more money than it is now. Well, and also I think people look at how much he was paid for how little screen time he had.
Yeah, right.
Because he's just a part of this massive ensemble cast, and there's no, he gets a lot less screen time and appears much later in the movie than a lot of other people.
Right. So Urquhart, who is Urquhart? Sean Connery.
He was Major General, head of the British 1st Airborne.
Yeah.
And I think he was confident, but he was not a paratrooper.
Do you remember a few months back when I was first appointed to this command? I told you I had never jumped, but thought I ought to give it a go.
Mm-hmm. He says in the movie he's never jumped before, and it turns out I found out that's true.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think I even get the impression that one of the problems with the British 1st Airborne is it was a unit that had been sort of pieced together from various battalions and regiments and really didn't have a lot of unit cohesion and hadn't really fought as a unit before.
Right.
And I think that they had a glider regiment as part of the division, and those were not paratroopers. Those were just there was a traditional infantry regiment that had been trained a little bit with gliders.
Right, yeah.
So there were lots of issues. But yeah, it's huge ensemble cast. At the time, I remember as a teenager marveling at how many people they had brought together for that movie. People like Michael Caine and Laurence Olivier and Dirk Bogarde. I mean, it's really a formidable cast.
Yeah, Dirk Bogarde is a I didn't know that's how you pronounce his name, but he's a big figure. He plays General Frederick Browning,
right?
Who was deputy commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, and so he is a cowardly figure in some ways in the movie. Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of controversy over the way he's depicted. I mean, I've read some critical things of him that maybe he wasn't the best commander, but. Yeah, I think I would say this: the responsibility for this defeat should be pretty widespread because there are a lot of problems with it, and it's certainly not just him.
Well, I think that we should maybe just talk about this now. Is that he identifies? He's told General Frederick Browning in the movie is told that we found these German tanks in the city. And so that's going to be that's obviously going to be a problem. But he didn't say anything to Montgomery because I guess he's afraid to tell Montgomery the truth about this.
Right.
And that seems to not really have happened.
Yeah, and or to at minimum, it seemed to sort of put on his shoulders. Whereas, it's my understanding, you had a much more widespread sort of attitude, and it's sort of depicted in the movie. Like, for example, in the movie, they show the radio operators who are afraid to rock the boat about how maybe the radio sets don't work, and that turns out to be a big problem for the British Airborne Division.
Yeah.
They have horrible communications. They can't communicate with the combat air patrols overhead, and they can't communicate with each other, and it's because the radios don't work. And that's laid at the feet of this broader sort of cultural issue within the British Army, which is, we are definitely going ahead with this operation. We're not going to cancel it like the others, and so you need to get on board. And you're right. I think in the movie that's sort of put unfairly, sort of solely on Browning's shoulders, whereas it's much more widespread. There was although throughout the entire command, there was an attitude that we need to go ahead with this. And by the way, the whole intelligence issue, I think, is handled very well by the movie. That there was this younger major, and actually the real character, his name is also Urquhart, no relation. They changed his name to Fuller in the movie. Mm-hmm. But there was this British major who had all this intelligence suggesting that the German forces in and around Arnhem, the key objective, were much stronger than anyone thought. And he really was sort of pushed aside and sort of sent on sick leave.
Yeah.
And by the way, that fellow, his name is Brian Urquhart. He actually went on to be sort of number 2 at the United Nations. He had a very successful career, but was sort of blown off as a junior intelligence officer. Who was right, by the way, that there were the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were in the Arnhem area refitting, and those are not the sort of forces that paratroopers want to run into.
Yeah, well, so let's just start to walk through the plot of the movie. So, so I guess sort of sequentially, because when you talk about the intelligence, there's a cool scene early in the movie where we're introduced to this family that is part of, I guess, part of the local resistance. That's
the Dutch resistance, exactly.
Yeah, and they're sort of feeding information to the Allies. Right.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the other big things I think the movie gets right by touching on, which is the huge cost to civilians in this battle. Even afterwards, so much of the area was wrecked. Thousands of Dutch sort of starved to death in the winter of 1944-45, partly because of all the damage caused by this battle. But yeah, so there is this intelligence being fed back to the British that they really aren't interested in hearing, and there's a fair amount in the movie about the planning of the operation, and they do a very good job of laying out how the British were not able to drop close to the objective. There's a good scene with the generals and this RAF officer.
I need drop zones as close as possible to the bridge. Now, clearly this area is no use at all. Can't have my chaps landing on the top of chimneys, but... Now, this looks inviting here. What's the terrain like?
Sorry, sir. All our reports indicate that this terrain here is too soft for glider landings. You see, the nose digs in first on touchdown, the whole thing goes arse over tip, total write-off.
All right. What about that?
No, afraid not, sir. You see, after the drop, when we bank for our return, we run into a whole lot of flak and rubbish in this very airfield up here at Deal.
Presumably you're intending to let us land somewhere.
Oh, yes, hopefully, sir. But
Roy Urquhart's head of the British 1st Airborne. He wants good drop zones close to the objective, and it turns out after this long discussion that they're not even on the reconnaissance photograph they're looking at. It's like 8 miles away from the bridge, where the landing zone, as the RAF officer says, is sort of flat and defensible, but it's so far from the objective. And so then they have to sort of come up with these other plans, like this reconnaissance force of jeeps to try and race ahead and seize the bridge. But there are just lots and lots of huge problems with the plan. One of them being that there aren't enough transport aircraft. You know, you're basically trying to drop 3+ divisions, and they don't have enough aircraft to do it all in one day. And so the British, they end up sending only this very weak force to the bridge because they can't drop all their forces on day one, and some of the forces they do drop have to sort of stay behind to protect these drop zones, right, so that you can be resupplied and reinforced. And that's just, I mean, I'm not an expert on airborne drops, but it's just not a very good plan, really.
Yeah, right. So,
I was just going to add one more thing. Part of the problem is there's no one taking charge from above, no one there to tell the RAF, look, you have to drop these troops close to the target no matter what. The RAF is terrified about losing planes, and they're terrified about flak around the bridges. And they are basically allowed to dictate where these landings take place, and it's just part of the larger disaster.
Yeah. So at that part of the movie, you know, so that's a good scene, a cool scene, where Sean Connery's character Urquhart, he asks the planners, you know, show me on this picture. So they're briefing through the plan. He says, show me on this picture where we're going to get dropped, and he has to point to the wall because it's not on the picture. So, you know, one of the things I read the John McManus book September Hope, and one of the things I think that may not be 100% clear in the movie is that, you know, many things had to go right for this to be successful, whereas I think I almost get the sense in the movie that it's like everything that could go wrong went wrong in the movie, when really everything, I mean, so many things had to go right for this to be successful.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's one of the fatal flaws in the plan, is that, you know, plans have to allow themselves wiggle room. You have to take into account the fog of war. You know, in this particular idea of advancing an entire corps up a single 2-lane road, it's not enough to take 7 out of 8 bridges. You have to have all 8. And if you don't take them by surprise, the Germans are going to tighten the defenses around them, and then you're basically relying on relatively lightly armed paratroopers to go on the offensive.
Yeah.
And that's just a recipe for disaster. I mean, the paratroopers are terrific in defense, but on offense, you know, against armored divisions, it's just not a great idea.
Yeah. So General Gavin is introduced in the movie. He's played by Ryan O'Neal. who I'm not really familiar with, but I don't know what else he's been in.
He was in Love Story, and he was in Paper Moon. He was a relatively big star in the 1970s. And also, apparently the movie criticized for... He was 35 at the time, and people criticized the movie for putting someone so young in that role. But of course, Gavin was, 37 at the time?
Gavin was 37, yeah.
So it was actually right on the money in terms of casting.
When I read the Gavin stuff, everything here is named after Gavin.
Right.
And it's Gavin, I'm 5 years older than Gavin was at that time. And I'm an Army Lieutenant Colonel. He was a general. So, right. I mean, it's really...
kind of puts it in perspective.
I know. So, speaking of Gavin, so this is from Gavin's book. I just want to read you this. This is from Gavin's book. Okay. I think this is important. And the truth is that this is captured well in the movie. So, this is a quote. He's talking about the planning of Market Garden. Optimism was pervasive in the highest headquarters. As early as 11 August, Major General Kenneth W.D. Strong, Eisenhower's chief of intelligence, thought the war would be over in 3 months. This is in August of 1944. Major General Beale Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, told members of the press in early September, militarily, the war is won. So, end quote. So I think that all of that, I guess we can understand that at that level, all of that would lead you into this sort of thing. So
right. Well, and that's one of the reasons why I think the British in particular assume that they're going to meet light opposition, and dropping so far from the objective is not such a big issue because there won't be any opposition, right? It'll be sort of old men and bicycles. And that's based on, they've had the Germans on the run for weeks. And the problem is they are a little slow to notice that by this point, by early September, the Germans are actually starting to get their act together. They're actually starting to rush reinforcements to the west. And they're starting to form defensible lines. And, and so the situation has changed without the Allies immediately noticing. And they're sort of getting caught up in this, the war is almost over, we've got them on the run. And then that's when you become cocky and careless. And by the way, Eisenhower shared this attitude too. I think it's one of the reasons Eisenhower approves this team, even if he has doubts about it, is we've got the Germans on the run, so now we can afford to take risks.
Yeah. So for our audience, for the 82nd, specific to our audience, so the 82nd fought for 33 days in Normandy without relief, without replacements. And then on July 8th, 1944, they returned to England. And so they hadn't done anything since then. So, July, the war is going. August, the war is going. And they hadn't been part of it. As you read the 82nd histories, the paratroopers were excited about this.
Oh, absolutely.
And particularly, so the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, they missed D-Day. So they obviously felt bad about that. They were in Anzio, and then because they stayed and fought in Anzio, they missed the D-Day prep. So then in August of 1944, and it's the last time we did an episode of the All American Legacy podcast, Ridgway was the commander. In August of 1944, Ridgway was given command of the new 18th Airborne Corps, which was the 82nd and the 101st Divisions. And so Ridgway gets Corps, and then Gavin is promoted to Major General at 37, 5 years younger than I am right now, and commands the 82nd Airborne Division. So I just want to set the table on that.
Right. Yeah, and I think the movie also gets a lot of little things right. Like, for example, he did injure himself pretty badly during the drop, and I don't think it was diagnosed at first. Am I correct in that?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, and he had to sort of fight a battle with 2 damaged discs in his spine or something?
Yeah, I don't think it was... Yeah, I think it was 1 damaged disc, and then he had a bruised back. Significant bruising in his back, so...
Right. And that's referred to in the movie. And he is sort of, as I recall, in the movie, he's sort of used as a representative of sort of the American clashes with the British, and almost sort of at a cultural level. Right? Yeah. He's very, very impatient and very gruff, and of course the British are a little more low-key, and a little more polished and polite, and there's some tension there, as I recall.
Yeah. Well, so that, I think, the big tension was between Julian Cook, who's played by Robert Redford, as you said.
Right.
So Julian Cook was the World War II commander of the 82nd Airborne Division's 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And, that's an interesting character because it's interesting in real life because as we read the accounts of Julian Cook, he wasn't really trusted by his men. His men kind of thought he was a coward up until this point. And then you see him.
So excuse me. So in other words, you think maybe he had something to prove?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he leads the. We're getting ahead of this, but he leads the Waal River crossing.
Right.
And that scene seems to be very accurate. You know, the 82nd had to cross this river with these boats, and Julian Cook leads them, and they're using their rifles as paddles to get across.
Right. That really is an amazing event in history, and I believe it was one of the British, I think it was maybe Browning, who said it was the most gallant action he had ever observed, because this is a very small unit. It's about 260 guys, about 2 companies, paddling across a really, really wide river in broad daylight under fire. I mean, it's like the worst military situation you could possibly be in.
Yeah. And if you read the accounts, the paratroopers were using handkerchiefs to stuff the bullet holes in the boats, and they're using...
and they had almost no training in the use of these boats. These are canvas boats that are something like 19 feet long. They're the flimsiest things you've ever seen.
Yeah. In the movie, Robert Redford's character, Julian Cook, is in a trance of fear. He keeps saying over and over again, "Hail Mary, full of grace."
Right.
And that's in the Cornelius Ryan book, and that's in many books. That seems to really have happened.
Mm-hmm, right. I think if anything, the one scene, and maybe we should just backtrack and set the stage for listeners. The 30th Corps does manage to advance up to Nijmegen, which is this major city just about 11 miles south of Arnhem. So they're well up the corridor. But the offensive bogs down in Nijmegen, where they're on the south side of the Nijmegen Bridge, which was a major road bridge and a major link in this whole road. The Germans were successfully protecting the southern end of the bridge in Nijmegen. That's where the advanced ground units of the British and the American 82nd were sort of bogged down. And so to take the bridge from the north side as well, they had this sort of river crossing, led by Julian Cook. I think, if anything, one of the things the movie misses, and maybe they couldn't show this, but from all accounts, the Americans who survived that first wave crossing the river essentially went berserk and were just like this unstoppable force and incredibly aggressive and incredibly reckless. And they came up first, before they got to the road bridge, they came first to this railroad bridge, which was being defended heavily by the Germans, and there were a lot of Germans on the bridge. And those Germans ended up getting trapped. And I read one recent account which said that after the battle, they found 200 German bodies on the railroad bridge. They had basically been slaughtered from both ends. And I think this is partly a measure of how sort of vengeful the members of the 504th were when they had got to that point.
Yeah. Well, there's the one scene where Robert Redford's character gets into a kind of explosive argument. I guess explosive is overselling it.
Right.
He gets into an argument with his...
It's very tense, certainly.
Yeah. British captain Lord Peter Carrington, and so they argue over the British forces refused to advance toward Arnhem after Cook's men they'd taken the Nijmegen Bridge.
Right, at great cost to themselves, and that's one of the reasons they're so fired up. Yeah.
Don't understand. Why aren't you moving? What's the matter with you guys? Those are British troops at Arnhem. They're hurt bad. You're not going to stop. Not now.
I'm sorry, we have our orders.
We busted our asses getting here. Half my men are killed, and you're just gonna stop and drink tea?
Look, we're now facing a completely different situation. We can't leave with tanks up that road. Jerry will pick us off like sitting ducks. Our infantry is still fighting in Nijmegen. When they get here, we'll move on.
For Christ's sake, must you do everything by the book?
Our orders are to wait for the infantry. I'm sorry, but there it is.
And the British captain is like really low-key about the whole thing. In fact, he doesn't even seem to want to get into an argument.
Right.
So in real life, that is said to have happened to T. Moffat Burris, who is we know him, he's been on this show. Right. He's one of the company commanders under Julian Cook. He claims to have had this exchange with Carrington. Carrington, for his part, says that this never happened this way. But Burris, he's still obviously alive, still attends our reunions, and he still is upset about this. He still feels that Arnhem was not a bridge too far, and he still talks about this. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I would, from my perspective, I would say that the whole question of whether the British troops at the Arnhem Bridge, and once again, to backtrack, even though most of the British 1st Airborne did not make it to Arnhem Bridge, their main objective, there was one battalion under John Frost that managed to sneak by, basically, along this river road. They advanced in about battalion force. They had seized the north end of the Arnhem Bridge and held it for about 4 days. And they were still technically clinging on at the time of the assault by Julian Cook and the taking of the Nijmegen Bridge, 11 miles to the south. I think that partly what's going on there is this sort of romantic notion that, had the British been more aggressive, they still could have made it. I'm not so sure, because I've read several accounts which suggest that the Germans, once they lost the Nijmegen Bridge, that they were rushing some reinforcements, including Tiger tanks, down that road. Because, they had access to that road from other points, not from Arnhem. If people want to look at a map, I know the geography is a little confusing. But in other words, it wouldn't necessarily have been just a quick dash up that last 11 miles of road to Arnhem. And the guy in the movie actually says this, that the first few Grenadier Guards tanks had made it across the Nijmegen Bridge, but they were not there in very significant force. So I would just say it remains open to question whether you could have actually saved the day the way Robert Redford implies in the movie.
Right. That is so. That scene happens on the 4th day of Operation Market Garden, September 21st, 1944. Right. So going through the movie on 23rd of September of 1944, after 7 days of battle all along the corridor, the bridge at Arnhem is effectively lost.
Right.
And so it becomes obvious to Sean Connery's character, to all the major players, that this had failed to succeed. And then, so Arnhem was a bridge too far. The term bridge too far refers to that. So closing the film out, we've got this is, I guess, one of the real problems with the movie is General Frederick Browning. We mentioned, played by Dirk Bogarde, Deputy Commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, tells Sean Connery's character, this is the next to last scene, tells him, well, as you know, I always felt we tried to go a bridge too far.
I took 10,000 men into Arnhem. I've come out with less than 2. I don't feel much like sleeping.
Quite. I've just been on to Monty. He's very proud and pleased.
Pleased?
Of course. He thinks Market Garden was 90% successful.
But what do you think?
Well, as you'll know, I've always thought that we tried to go a bridge too far.
And this contradicts his very public optimism earlier in the film. And it looks like he's sort of protecting himself from Sean Connery's outrage.
Right, make him look like a hypocrite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that did not happen that way. But, nonetheless...
Right. Yeah, he actually said it before, during the planning of the operation, which that makes him look a little bit better, because that shows that he actually had some misgivings. But, of course, like anyone else, he sort of went along with it.
Yeah.
But...
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's also true in the movie, and I think maybe even in that last scene, it's between just Roy Urquhart, who has been rescued with a fraction of his division. Yeah. And that's the last phase of the operation, is basically saving the remnant of the 1st Airborne Division, even though about 3/4 of it was killed or captured. Mm-hmm. And he has this sort of confrontation with Browning. And I think Browning begins the conversation by saying how General Montgomery's very pleased because we've made it so far up this corridor.
Yeah.
And of course, that's, just painting a happy face on the defeat, because obviously the objective was not just to make it up this corridor, but a corridor to nowhere, as it turned out to be. The object was to get across the Rhine, which they failed at.
Yeah. It is a pretty intense scene, though. It is a good scene in terms of, in terms of the movie.
No, it's two great actors too.
Yeah. So I just want to talk about one last historic thing before we talk about the movie as a movie. And you and I spoke about this a little bit last night, that there was either confusion or there was some sort of failure here. That it seems like, well, a lot of accounts show that General Gavin wanted the 508th to retain Grosbeck Heights, and before they captured the Waal River bridges, and so there was some confusion in terms of the way this was manifested in action.
Right. Yeah. And here, I think once again, and it's not the only part of the operation where you see this, is that you're basically got too many objectives for the force you initially land, right? Because just south of Nijmegen, keep in mind most of Holland is extremely flat. But just southeast of Nijmegen, there's a sort of relatively prominent ridge known as the Grosbeck Heights. And so in the planning, they decided to make that the priority, because if you cede that high ground to the Germans, then they will have a commanding view of the entire road and will be able to sort of disrupt the entire operation. So the decision was made to take those heights first and then take the Nijmegen Bridge second. But of course, then you lose the element of surprise, and you allow the Germans to rush forces south to defend the Nijmegen Bridge, and then you basically got an airborne unit that has to fight an urban fight to take a bridge that's pretty heavily defended by SS Panzer Grenadiers. And so then, the question was, maybe the priority should have been a little different. Maybe you go for the bridge first and worry about the heights later. But like I said, it's part of this larger problem. You've got these two sort of conflicting objectives, and not enough force landed on the first day to take both those objectives. And of course, and you mentioned the weather too. The weather then interferes with the whole operation, and they can't land the second and third waves as quickly as they like. I think the glider regiment, the 325th, didn't land until I think 3 days later.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yeah. So you've got with paratroop operations, you've got to land as much as you can immediately to seize the objective when you have surprise. If you sort of feed the troops in slowly, you're really sort of fighting with one hand tied behind your back, and you see this in the operations around Nijmegen.
Right. Yeah, and so I think that some of Operation Market Garden speaks to the way that you talked about this a little bit, the way that paratroopers were used throughout the war. There seems to sort of have been a tension that was never resolved about, do we use them in a tactical sense, like in maybe Sicily, like very close to their objectives? Do we use them to reinforce things that are already secure, like in Salerno? Do we use them in a strategic sense, miles from the objective? And that was never really, this was the fourth combat jump, and that was never really resolved.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, if you look at the Normandy jumps, right, those are sort of to protect the flanks of the landing and to sort of secure some of the, I believe, with the 101st. Which division? Which division was supposed to seize the causeways for the Utah Beach?
The 101st.
Oh, it was 101st. Okay. Yeah. So in other words, so you're just protecting the flanks, but also seizing these sort of exit routes to make sure that the beachhead can be expanded. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And then you've got this entirely new concept that you're going to lay down this carpet of paratroopers over dozens and dozens of miles, so that ground force can advance up a single road. And then, of course, then you've got to make sure you keep the whole road open afterwards. And do you have a sufficient force to do that? So yeah, this is it seems like they're sort of making this up as they go along in terms of how to use paratroopers. Right.
So okay, I think that is probably as deep as we want to go with Market Garden. So one of the things I found is that this is kind of interesting, is that people weren't really paying attention to Market Garden until Cornelius Ryan wrote this book. He wrote the book in 1974.
Right.
And Operation Market Garden seems to largely have been forgotten. And then the movie is made in 1977. And the movie is in some ways not necessarily a sequel, but a supplement to The Longest Day, which was also based on which is about D-Day, which was also based on a Cornelius Ryan book.
Right. Yeah. That's, in terms of public understanding, I think you're absolutely right. I think until the book and the movie in the mid-'70s, I think most people's understanding of the Western Front would be dominated by these two pillars, one being Normandy and the other being the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah.
Which, of course, have both already had their own movies by this point. And in a way, I assume what Cornelius Ryan is doing is partly filling in the gap, because there were obviously lots of fighting. But in terms of major spectacular battles, this is the major one between the Normandy breakout and Battle of the Bulge. So in a way, it's sort of filling in the gap.
Right. So as a movie, I think I told you this, so I started watching this. I watched it the first time when I was 9. And it's tough because if you don't have this sort of grounding in what was happening in the war and who people were, you just lost. I feel like you're lost.
Oh, yeah. Well, especially, also the battle itself is so sprawling.
Yeah.
You've got 3 airborne divisions on the ground, and then you've got the garden aspect, the sort of the British ground troops. You've got what's going on the ground with individual soldiers, like they have this subplot with James Caan as a 101st Airborne Sergeant Eddie Doan.
Yeah.
And so the viewer is constantly being jerked back and forth between high command, the airborne part, the 30th Corps part, and when I first saw it, I thought it was great because I was sort of a military history geek and I knew a lot about it already. But a lot of other people, including people I saw the movie with, were totally sort of perplexed and couldn't follow the movie sort of geographically in their heads because there was just so much going on and so much was trying to be depicted, I guess.
Yeah. Well, when I got this job, when I got selected to do this job, I had to watch it with a map so that I knew. Yeah. And it's like, it's good in understanding history, but who wants to watch a movie with a map?
Exactly right.
I mean, is that really...
There's a scene which apparently is very, very realistic where Brian Horrocks, commander of British 30th Corps, is briefing all of his officers. And he gets up on the stage with this massive map.
Gentlemen, this is a story that you will tell your grandchildren, and mightily bored they'll be. The plan is called Operation Market Garden. Market is the airborne element, and Garden the ground forces. That's us. Now, this is our position on the Belgian border here. Tomorrow...
He sort of explains it.
Yeah.
And I assume they put that in there partly, to sort of educate the viewers.
Yeah.
But like you said, you don't have that map in front of you for the whole movie.
Yeah. So, and then I had to take notes, and it feels like work every time I watch this thing.
Right.
So...
Yeah, I agree. Well, it's 3 hours long. People should know that. It's a 3-hour movie. People are not used to watching 3-hour movies.
Right. If you come into the 82nd Airborne Division today, you have to watch it. If you're a new paratrooper.
Oh, really? It's required viewing?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how this is enforced, but it's played and you sit there.
Right.
It's played and you sit there. So.
And I assume any movie that depicts historical action by the 82nd Airborne, I mean, that essentially should be required, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's entertaining. I'm not sure it's a good movie.
Oh, I agree. There are many more sort of captivating movies out there.
Yeah.
In a way, the way to approach this maybe is more of as a documentary, because I think
exactly
it does get a lot. It gets a lot of the big things right about the battle, and you can learn. If you don't want to read a book about it, you can learn a lot about the battle from watching the movie. But I agree in terms of an exercise in entertainment. Personally, I don't think it really succeeds.
So this is a review. This is, I think, humorous. This is a review from Roger Ebert. Roger Ebert is the famous.
Right. Yeah. One of the greats.
Everybody my age knows him from the show where he gave thumbs up or thumbs down. What was that show called?
Right. Was it called Sneak Previews?
It doesn't matter.
I should know this, but anyway. I think he helped popularize the whole thumbs up, thumbs down thing.
Yeah. So this is from 1977 from Roger Ebert. Because A Bridge Too Far is such an exercise in wretched excess, such a mindless series of routine scenes, such a boringly violent indulgence in all the blood and guts and moans they could find, by the end, we're prepared to speculate that maybe the film went 2 or even 3 bridges too far. The movie's big and expensive and filled with stars, but it's not an epic. It's the longest B-grade war movie ever made.
Right.
So
yeah.
I take that as
that
a
is
thumbs down.
harsh, and unfortunately, I think he may be right on the money.
Yeah. There are a couple of things that are, I think, against it. Is that, if you think about Saving Private Ryan was about a big thing, about a big event, and a series of things, but it focused on character development. It didn't go so granular that you couldn't lock into the characters, and so one of the
absolutely right. Yep. Yeah, in The Bridge Too Far, basically all the starring roles end up becoming cameos in that sense, right? In other words, you don't come to identify with any of these people because they're not on screen long enough.
Yeah, and I felt in watch. I've seen it now like 8 or 9 times, and I think in watching it more recently, I feel like what's missing is you get the presence of Patton and Montgomery hanging over this.
Right.
Get to be the first to get to Germany. You'd be the first to get to Berlin, but they're not really in any way part of it. Maybe it gets too big at that point, but
right.
Like the movie Patton is, for me, one of the great entertaining movies.
Sure.
Because you just see what his drive and his ambition and his sense of his inflated, I guess, notion of himself, what that does to the people around him.
Yeah, you come to understand him as a character.
Exactly. Yeah.
And sort of what makes him tick.
Yeah.
Right, which makes it far more compelling. Whereas, like I said, I think Bridge Too Far is a little more sort of antiseptic.
Yeah. So I really think that it captures the enormity. I think you said that.
Mm-hmm.
And but there's so many different characters.
Right.
And like a movie like Zero Dark 30. Zero Dark 30. You already know what's going to happen at the end, obviously.
Right, and yet it's still very compelling.
But it's still very compelling, and there's also this sense of like dread over Zero Dark 30 that does happen at the levels below. In a Bridge Too Far, there was a sense of dread at the levels below the general officer level. That this was something that was very big and it might not work. So you didn't really get that feel in the movie.
Right.
So
I think there's also another issue watching the movie now. In a way, this is a little unfair, but it's been 40 years since that came out, and I think if you look at something like Zero Dark 30, or if you look at Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers, war movie making has come a long way. If you look at things like production values and realism, and even little things like explosions, I think it's come a long way. So, at the time, 1977, I think in some ways it was sort of state of the art. You can always find little problems. They obviously had difficulty getting operational tanks, like operational German tanks, which they did not have trouble with for Band of Brothers.
Right.
They actually had a couple, which is a good trick these days.
Yeah.
But, in terms of 1977, I think it did pretty well. And Roger Ebert referred to the gore. There are some pretty gory scenes in that movie, which was not normal for war movies even that late. We get used to it now because they're much more graphic.
Right.
But I think it was sort of striking at the time. So, yeah, I think maybe it doesn't hold up in that sense, partly because of an unfair comparison. The production values in something like Band of Brothers is really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Bridge Too Far, it's easier to find sort of slip-ups and little mistakes. And if you go on if people are interested on IMDb, they have a long, long list of tiny little sort of trivial mistakes they make in the movie, which I guess is typical.
Yeah.
You always make compromises. And by the way, you always put certain people's quotes in other people's mouths, and you combine characters. Like Hardy Kruger plays this other high-ranking German, and his name is General Ludwig. Well, that's a composite figure. He represents both the commanders of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. Their names were Harmel and Harzer. So you will not find Ludwig in any index in any book. That's a composite figure, and movies do that all the time.
Yeah.
But like I said, I don't think it holds up very well compared to today's movies. But that's once again kind of an unfair comparison.
Yeah, there is one exchange that I thought was really affecting when Robert Redford, Ryan O'Neill, General Gavin tells Julian Cook to cross the bridge. And he says, I'm looking for, he's giving him the order, and he's sort of pumping up Julian Cook, and he says, we need somebody who's brave enough, he's got to be brave enough to do it, and he's got to be dumb enough to do it.
Where's Major Cook, soldier? I think over there, sir. Thank you.
Julian, where the hell are you?
Here, sir.
We're going to take Nijmegen Bridge tonight. What's the best way to take a bridge?
Both ends at once.
I'm sending 2 companies across the river by boat. I need a man with very special qualities to lead.
Go on, sir.
He's got to be tough enough to do it. And he's got to be experienced enough to do it. Plus one more thing. He's got to be dumb enough to do it. Start getting ready.
And I cannot find where that ever happened, but I think it's effective in the movie.
Sure, exactly. Well, and it's sort of a nice sentiment, right? And it's like, on the one hand, you know, what does it take to do something this foolhardy?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because if you overthink this, you're probably going to try and talk your way out of it, because it really is sort of suicidal. And I think that first wave of boats crossing the Waal River, they suffer essentially 50% casualties, which is, and that's just horrible. I mean, that's so way off the charts.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Anything else we need to talk about here? So this is the question I posed to a couple of people. If you had to do a remake, who plays Gavin? Who plays Gavin? Who plays Julian Cook?
That's really hard. See, I mean, part of my personal problem is I always try to find someone who looks a little bit like the historical figure. And, of course, the problem with that is you might find someone who's a lookalike but not a very good actor or not a very famous actor.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, that's a really good question.
Well, people here...
If you look at Gavin's face...
Yeah.
Maybe I need to study it more carefully, but he looks a little bit like Christian Slater.
Yeah.
But he's not a huge actor these days. Well, so when you ask people, what do they say? Who do they recommend?
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon?
Matt Damon is 46 right now.
So maybe when he was doing the first Bourne movies, he would have been a better, better stand-in for Gavin. That wouldn't be a bad choice, I suppose.
Somebody said Ben Affleck. I don't know that he's still around, but
Ben Affleck is. Ben Affleck. Well, I have a question. How tall was Gavin? Do you know? Because Ben Affleck, I think, is kind of tall. Maybe Matt Damon would be better in that regard.
Yeah. Some other people had Tom Hanks as Urquhart. I don't know if that makes much sense.
I don't know how good a British accent he does. I mean, apparently, Sean Connery was chosen largely because of his looks. And if you look at photos of Urquhart, they actually do. There's a real resemblance. They're both big guys, both wore mustaches. That's a pretty good resemblance.
Yeah.
Edward Fox's face looks a little like Brian Horrocks, although Brian Horrocks was taller. Edward Fox is not very tall, but that was actually a pretty good bit of casting. I think a lot of people were critical of Gene Hackman playing General Sosabowski.
Why is that?
Hackman's a great actor, but he doesn't have the best Polish accent.
Right.
And so I think that was the case where they just got sort of a relatively big name.
Yeah.
But, casting is always a nightmare for historical dramas because people like us will always pick it apart.
Yeah, so I think if you had to do it again, you'd focus, in my mind, specifically on the 3rd Battalion. You'd focus it on one unit, 3rd Battalion 504.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then as you suggested, maybe allow this more tightly focused picture to sort of stand in for the larger picture rather than try and tell all phases of this incredibly complex battle.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's usually a better, and like you said, audiences want to be drawn in, audiences want to identify with a particular character, and you can't when there are 24 bankable stars, each of whom has like 15 minutes on the screen.
Right. Yeah. Good. Okay, I think that closes us out here on A Bridge Too Far.
Okay, well, I would urge people to see the movie themselves, make their own opinions if they can sit through it.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to be asked to leave the 82nd Airborne Division now that I've talked negatively about this movie.
Now that you have badmouthed the sacred Bridge Too Far.
But I'm not sure I would. I mean, I think you don't have to watch it now. I think you've listened to this.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly right.
These are
the Cliff Notes of the movie.
This is going to be like, an hour? And so the movie, we saved you 2 hours. We just saved you 2 hours.
What are you going to do with the 2 hours you gained because of us?
All right. Always great talking to you.
All right. Thanks so much.
Take care. Bye.
Okay.
Dr. Phil Nash. That was a great talk, a good talk. Interesting guy, interesting perspective on these things, and always great to have him on the show. He'll be back We hope you're back. The show is really taking off. We don't know exactly what's happening here, but thousands more people are listening to the All-American Legacy podcast. Now we want to continue to expand that. We want to expand it outside of the 82nd Airborne Division, and we want the American public to listen to this show. We want to start recruiting from the American public. The ratings and reviews that you leave on iTunes help other people find the show. So leave a rating, leave a review, and we thank you for all your support. The All-American Legacy podcast is produced by the 82nd Airborne Division Public Affairs Office. Tell your friends about it. Come to All-American Week 100. Thanks. See you next week.